We should be clear that a peace agreement in the form of a ceasefire does not mean peace for Ukrainians living in the territories occupied by Russia. It means torture, it means forced Russification, it means killing potentially.
How can we secure this potential upcoming peace deal to make it really hold this time?
I think a lot more could be done to disrupt Russian oil trading, which is the major source of revenue that they use to do things like pay people to enlist in the military and keep their economy afloat. We should rethink any historical narratives that suggest that Russia has some right to political or social or cultural dominance outside of its own borders. A political system like Russia's, what we would call a personalist dictatorship, often are quite fragile.
Hi everyone, my name is Zhenya Melnik and this is United 24 Media. Before I announce our today's guest in our Zoom In series, I would like to kindly ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet and hit a like button. This will greatly help the algorithm to push our video in your streams. So thanks for that. Our guest today is Dr. Brian Taylor. He's a professor at Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. He's been studying Russia for many years. It's his specialization. So today we're going to discuss Russia's geopolitical goals, Russia's views on Ukraine and the West, and we're going to discuss the ways how to prevent Russia to achieve what they want. Hi, Brian. It's so nice to see you. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for finding the time and speaking with us today.
Happy to do so. Thank you.
Thanks. And let's begin our conversation. So you've been studying Russia and Putin himself for quite a significant time. So do you think Putin is really open for any kind of negotiation about peace with Ukraine, or what is the game or strategy he's playing?
Yes, I don't think Putin is really interested in an equitable and fair peace. I think his goals remain the same that they've been really for decades now, not just since even 2014 or 2022, but for longer than that. He believes that Ukraine should be in some sense under Russian control and Russia's sphere of influence, and he's been working for that goal for quite some time, and he's not going to give it up, I don't think, easily. So in his view, peace would mean, the things he's been talking about consistently, which is territorial changes, Ukrainian neutrality, what he refers to as demilitarization and denazification, which basically means a weak Ukraine unable to defend itself, and a Ukraine whose domestic politics are in some sense shaped by Russian demands rather than what Ukrainians themselves want. So I don't think he's really shifted his position much, but of course, with the change in administration in Washington, he sees an opportunity to extract something from the new U.S. administration, which certainly is not going to be for the benefit of Ukraine if he gets what he wants from the Americans. So.
What do you think? How should we understand these peace talks that happened today in Saudi with the US representatives and Russia's representatives?
Well, I personally think the whole idea of starting these negotiations without participation of Ukraine and without participation of major European countries is a mistake, because I'm not quite sure what the Americans and the Russians can talk about with respect to any kind of settlement in Ukraine without Ukrainians involved in the process. Now, I think, and to a certain extent, I would say I fear that they will be talking not only about Ukraine, but also what we used to call a reset in Russian-American relations, which could mean things like easing of sanctions, other arrangements about what the U.S. military posture might be in Europe going forward, what U.S. policy towards NATO enlargement might be. And all of those conversations, I believe, are really conversations that have to happen in some kind of multilateral basis and not simply between Washington and Moscow. But obviously, the Trump administration feels differently about this. Donald Trump, for whatever reason, wants to, be in conversation with Putin about the fate of the world. I don't think that's the way the world works in the 21st century, but that seems to be the way Trump and Putin see the world. So I think that's the impetus for these talks. Whether anything meaningful will come out of it, I'm somewhat skeptical, but I guess we'll have to wait and see as the story develops.
Given Russia's track record in terms of breaking the agreements with Ukraine, we had Minsk agreement, we had Budapest memorandum. How can we secure this potential upcoming peace deal to make it really hold this time?
So I want to take both parts of the question. First, in terms of just emphasizing how often Russia has violated its own commitments in international law with respect to Ukraine. Obviously, there's the UN Charter, there's the Helsinki Agreement, there was the Almaty Declaration when the Soviet Union collapsed, where all 15 successor republics recognized the boundaries of those new states as they were in 1991. Budapest Memorandum, as you mentioned, but there was also the Ukrainian-Russian Treaty on Friendship from 1997, which recognized those borders, and the actual agreement on the border in 2003, which Putin himself signed, which also recognized the 1991 borders. So they have violated all of those agreements. As you noted, they violated Minsk. And so I wouldn't put a lot of faith in just Russia's word about any sort of agreement, which brings us to the second part of the question, which is how can it be meaningful in some sense? And in this respect, I agree with what President Zelensky has been saying, that any agreement has to have meaningful security guarantees of some sort for Ukraine. And of course, that's what a lot of the negotiation is likely to be about, because Ukraine wants NATO membership. Some members of NATO would be open to that at the moment. Obviously, the current U.S. administration and some other countries are not open to that. So then we have the discussion about, well, are there countries that are willing to put their troops in Ukraine to secure such an agreement? We saw the statement from the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer earlier this week that Britain would be willing to consider this. Some other countries are willing to consider it. But it's actually quite, a difficult task militarily to put a sustainable force there that would be meaningful. And if that doesn't happen, then the third strategy that people have sometimes talked about is what they call the porcupine strategy, which is arming Ukraine so much that it can defend itself. The idea is sort of like the U.S. relationship with Israel, which was never a formal treaty commitment, but they provide enough weapons that Israel believes it can defend itself against any potential enemies. So there would be that option. I think Ukrainians are skeptical that that wouldn't be enough. And I'm personally skeptical that the U.S. under the current administration would be willing to provide enough assistance to make that meaningful. So long and short of it is I'm not optimistic about any form of agreement that provides meaningful security guarantees at the moment, unfortunately.
Let's imagine if negotiations fail, what other ways other than military can be used as a tool to shift the dynamic in Ukraine's favor?
Yes, I hope the conversation eventually returns to this issue once these negotiations play out and, in my view, likely fail, because there are a lot of tools that the West has to influence the results of the conflict. And I think I would start by stressing that although a lot of the narrative now is about Russian military success, Russia has really moved, the line of conflict very little in 2024 and early 2025 at the cost of massive, massive losses, right? They are chewing through a huge number of troops, huge number of equipment for very small gains. And if we look at especially some of the equipment situations facing the Russians in terms of tanks and armored personnel carriers and artillery, within the space of a year, they might start to have real shortages. So I think if the West really sort of doubled down on providing further military support to Ukraine, and I would have to add Ukraine figured out its personnel issue, which is a large issue, right, on the military side. But I think there's ways to put pressure on Russia on the battlefield. And then secondly, I would say there are really important ways to put further economic pressure on Russia. The Biden administration in the last few weeks of its administration announced new sanctions that apply to oil shipments in the so-called shadow fleet of Russian tankers. I think a lot more could be done to disrupt Russian oil trading, which is the major source of revenue that they use to do things like pay people to enlist in the military and keep their economy afloat. So the West is, in aggregate, more powerfully economically and militarily than Russia if it used these tools to put more pressure on Russia. And only then, I think, will Putin be put in a position where he's forced to talk seriously about ending the war.
Do you believe in a statement that if Ukraine is somehow put in the position that we are forced to sign an agreement without actual serious guarantees, such as NATO, for example, that this will only mean a break that will allow Putin to regroup and attack Ukraine more?
Yes, I certainly think that any kind of ceasefire in place without credible security guarantees will do exactly what you suggested, which is to give Putin and Russia a chance to re-equip, regroup, and go again in the future. And I come back to where we started this conversation. Putin's goal all along has been political control over Ukraine, and that includes Kyiv, right? I mean, he doesn't really care about, let's say, Avdiivka or Kupiansk or someplace like that, right? He cares about control over Ukraine politically in the capital and having someone in power in Kyiv who is sympathetic to him and to Russia, right? So that's what really he is aiming for. And a ceasefire at the moment would only sort of delay that process. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing for Ukraine because Ukraine could also use that time to regroup and rearm and prepare, but only under the conditions in which its Western supporters use that time to help strengthen Ukraine's position militarily, economically, and politically for a potential future Russian restart of the war.
We understand now the Russia's strategy in terms of Ukraine, but could you maybe explain a little bit more? What is Russia's wider geopolitical goals? What is he's trying to achieve, and maybe how did this strategy shifted over the last 20 years of Putin's reign? Yeah.
Well, I think we can talk about Putin's sort of geopolitical or foreign policy strategy in two parts. One is he wants Russian political control, domination, sphere of influence, whatever you want to call it, in the former Soviet space and potentially in also parts of Central and Eastern Europe. So he wants Russia to be a dominant voice in that part of the world. But I also think internationally, he has this image of Russia as one of a so-called big three, with the United States and China and Russia kind of making the decisions about the globe. He has this romantic image of the end of World War II, where, you know, Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt and then Truman were sort of deciding the fate of the planet. And he thinks Russia deserves to be at the table making those sorts of decisions today. My own view is the world is not ready to go back to that kind of great power diplomacy where the big powers make decisions for all the other countries around the world. But I think that's a world that Putin would be comfortable with and that he's striving for. But I think most countries in the world, and we see this reflected in, for example, UN General Assembly votes with respect to the Russian attack on Ukraine, most countries in the world don't believe in going back to that 19th, early 20th century style diplomacy, and they believe in a world order in which borders are protected, sovereignty is protected, agreements are settled, not on the battlefield, lines of control are not redrawn by who's stronger, international law is respected. All of those norms that have been part of the UN system since the end of World War II are what most of the world wants to live under. So I think Putin has a rather antiquated view of world order. And to answer the final part of your question, I actually don't think he's changed that much on this over the last 25 years. I mean, I know some people say, oh, early Putin was a different Putin and, he was much more friendly towards the West. But I only think that's because he was imagining a world in which the United States and Russia sort of decided what the world was going to look like. And once he figured out that at least the US prior to Donald Trump wasn't interested in dividing up the world with Putin, then he took a more hostile attitude towards those relationships.
Do you personally believe there is a chance that the West preserves this world order as we know it, the normal one? And what are the ways to achieve that, to secure that?
I mean, I think it's honestly a really difficult moment now for this so-called, liberal international order, which many people in many countries are committed to, but Russia's not committed to it. The U.S. currently, honestly, with Donald Trump as president, doesn't seem to be committed to it, and we can see that with all of the talk, rather ridiculous in my view, about Canada becoming part of the United States or the United States taking over Greenland and all this other kind of conversation. The U.S. currently is not committed to that order, but the major European countries are committed to it. A lot of countries in the global South are committed to it. So I think it will sort of hold in some respect. But when two of the major countries, arguably three of the major countries of the world, China as well, are skeptical about some of those rules, then that world order is on quite shaky ground at the moment, unfortunately.
Talking about China, I heard the opinion that China is not really Russia's ally, that they're like waiting for the Russia to kind of fail and to become the global power, as you mentioned. What do you think about that? What's China's interest in all this?
Well, I mean, it's literally true that Russia and China are now allies in the sense that they have a mutual treaty committing themselves to come to the defense of the other country. But they do talk about this so-called partnership without limits. And I think there is something to that relationship. I think Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are relatively close personally. I think they both want to see the U.S. Reduced in power and influence in the world, and they certainly don't like a world order in which other countries criticize how their domestic politics are run in terms of violations of human rights and authoritarianism and those sorts of things. So they agree on those basic issues. And I think China really wants to have a positive relationship with Russia, not only because of those, views of the international system, but also because it's a good source of oil and gas for China. And they want the North to be secure and stable because their major orientation right now is to the southeast in the Pacific with respect to Taiwan, with respect to the U.S. presence there. So I don't think there's really the basis for splitting Russia and China apart. Some people like to imagine that can happen. I don't see that happening as long as Putin and Xi Jinping are in power, and we shouldn't have any illusions that we can sort of pry those two countries apart. And ultimately, China has been an important partner for Russia in this war, not in the direct sense, but in the indirect sense that parallel imports of material that should be banned because of the sanctions flow into Russia through China. Some Chinese banks participate in the process of funding schemes between the two countries. And of course, China is still buying a lot of Russian oil. So I wouldn't look to China too much to be a helpful partner in settling this dispute in a way that's advantageous for Ukraine.
So all Russia's narratives about civilizational war between Russia and the West, it's more about the power play, right? About the getting more control over political control. But how successful is Russia in implementing this narrative domestically? What do you think?
Well, to a certain extent, I don't think it's just a narrative. I really think people like Putin and some of his closest advisors, people like Nikolai Patrushev, who used to be Secretary of the Security Council, other people around Putin, I think they really believe, to put it simply, that the West is out to get them, has been out to get them for a long time, is trying to undermine it not only internationally, but domestically. So they see Russian actors, internal domestic actors who ask for democracy and human rights as just being tools of the West. And I think Putin really does see the world that way, right? Have they succeeded in promoting that narrative domestically? From what we can tell from public opinion data, and it's somewhat suspect in a country like Russia, but it does seem that this narrative that the West is out to get us, we need to be strong, those sorts of narratives. Also, the stuff about culture, whether it's LGBTQ rights and all those sorts of things, I think those often resonate domestically with Russians. Um, so even though when the Cold War ended, many Russians were very pro-Western, very pro-American, wanted to sort of join the community of wealthy, successful democracies, I think they became disillusioned with that vision in the 1990s. And then with the way Putin has promoted this narrative pretty incessantly on Russian media for several decades, I think a lot of Russians buy into that. Not all of Russians, obviously, but a significant portion of them.
I heard several opinions that the Western academia world still, especially in the in the history sector, historians, they kind of live by the rules and books and works of Russian academics, and there is like a strong pro-Russian sentiment in this group of people. If I'm putting it lousy. So how did the Russo-Ukrainian war affect this community, and do you notice any shifts in this case?
Yes, this is a really interesting question, and it's actually a lively discussion of debate at conferences and things like that when people who study, Russia, Eurasia, Eastern Europe sort of get together. I personally am not a historian, I'm a political scientist. But what I would say is there probably is some truth to the claim that, historically, Western scholars who studied that part of the world often saw things through the Russian lens. Not necessarily that they believed everything, but that was kind of their frame of reference. And maybe to some extent, that's kind of inevitable because Russia is the biggest country in that part of the world. So, people who study South Asia, they probably look more to India than they look to Sri Lanka, for example, or people who study Europe are more likely to study Germany and France than they are Switzerland, right, and Belgium, right? I mean, maybe some of that's just inevitable, but I think the really important point is to what extent do people not only sort of have that orientation, but how much do they buy into Russian historical narratives, and how much does that shape people's scholarship? And I would say there's been a pretty important change in the last 3 years in that respect. My sense of people I talk to in the field is that most people who are experts on Russia, whether they're historians, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, whatever, most of them are actually quite appalled by this war, by the war crimes that are being committed by Russia in this war, this unprovoked act of aggression. I think many scholars have been open to the characterization of this war as genocidal, which I think there's some evidence for that viewpoint. And in my opinion, and at least my experience, the American scholars who tend to promote pro-Russian narratives actually aren't experts on Russia. They're actually sort of international relations scholars who don't really know Russia, don't really know the history, don't really understand the society or the political system. And there are, some famous names I could throw out, but I'm not going to at this point. But I would just say that my view of the field, just based on interacting with people really since 2014, but also especially since 2022, is most scholars, if you ask them at the personal level, they're kind of on the side of Ukraine because they think Ukraine has been wronged, that it is being wronged, that what Russia is doing is illegal and immoral. And we should rethink any historical narratives that suggest that Russia has some right to political or social or cultural dominance outside of its own borders. So that's the way I see the discourse going among the scholars I talk to.
Can we speak a little bit about Russia's weak points? how do we fight it, basically? If we understand that militarily it's possible, but it's difficult, diplomatically we don't know. But in your opinion, so where should Ukraine and the West aim at?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, we sort of talked about this a bit earlier in terms of things like increased sanctions, especially targeting the shadow fleet of oil tankers.
That's more of a consequence. Maybe you know of something that has been not displayed or not discussed enough. That's what I mean.
Okay, so I mean, I think all of these things have been discussed quite a bit, right? Ways of trying to tighten sanctions, the sorts of military assistance to Ukraine that will be most meaningful. I think the Ukrainian drone campaign against Russian energy installations in Russia are important and having some impact. Um, in terms of vulnerabilities, hypothetically, a political system like Russia's, what we would call a personalist dictatorship, often are quite fragile. But it's easy to say that in the abstract, but it's quite harder to see a way from the outside to put pressure on that type of political system. I think there were some Americans who had the hope very early after the full-scale invasion in 2022 that they could sort of split the elite from Putin. And I think that to the extent there was any hope of that, that did not succeed and has failed. So I think it's really the sort of standard tools that we've talked about, military pressure, helping Ukraine militarily, economic pressure on Russia, which is one of their weak points, and diplomatic activity, because most of the world has voted to say that what Russia is doing is illegal and should be stopped. And so Ukraine, I think, should continue to reach out not only to supporters in Europe, but around the world who believe that what Russia is doing is illegitimate. Whether that's going to shift the course of the war, probably not anytime soon. But it's important as discussions about peace settlements, et cetera, become more active, that the rest of the world hears what Ukraine has to say about only a just peace and only a peace that will secure Ukraine going forward is one that Ukrainians are interested in. And this is not really an answer to your question, but it's something I want to emphasize for anyone who listens to this at some point. We should be clear that a peace agreement in the form of a ceasefire does not mean peace for Ukrainians living in the territories occupied by Russia. It means torture. It means forced Russification. It means killing potentially. It means increasing hardship. So those people will not be at peace, even if the shooting between the militaries stops for a while. And we should bear that in mind and say that that is, illegal and against international law. And we are going to keep our focus on those people who would be suffering and continue to suffer under Russian occupation if there is a ceasefire.
Do you personally believe in the scenario that Russia could potentially fall apart from the inside? As an example, like the minorities that live in Russia that actually are fighting this war more than Russians themselves. What do you think about that?
There's been a lot more discussion about that in the last couple of years. I personally am skeptical about that as something that is going to happen anytime soon, or something that would cause Russia to fail and fall out of the war. And I would say this for a couple of reasons. Russia is much more ethnically Russian and homogeneous than it was when the Soviet Union existed, right? I mean, the Soviet Union was 50% non-Russian. The Russian Federation is 80% Russian. And if we look at where the different ethnic republics, or national republics are inside Russia, most of them don't have external borders, or the majority of their population are actually ethnically Russian. So if we look at the countries that have the regions that have an external border and have a majority of the population that's non-Russian, it's really just Chechnya and Dagestan. And Chechnya and Dagestan are highly dependent on Russia economically. A lot of their budget comes from Moscow. And I don't think we've seen any public opinion data at the regional level, going back several decades that makes me think there's a strong push for national independence across, many of these. There are more than 20 of them ethnic regions of Russia. So I wouldn't see that as a way that the war will come to an end with some kind of disintegration of Russia. I do think that at some point Russia needs to internally return to a form of federalism in which the regions of Russia have more of a voice and have more political autonomy. But that's going to be a long-term process.
And one of the last questions I would like to address, as a professor who knows a lot about Russia, Ukraine, and who follows the conflict closely, what would be your three maybe recommendations in terms of books that our viewers might want to read, just to have a better understanding on what is happening?
Interesting question. I'm going to be not modest and start by mentioning my most recent book. My most recent book is called Russian Politics, a very short introduction. So if you're someone who, has a passing interest in Russia, but not a lot of deep knowledge, it's a very short introduction to the topic. So, and that came out just in October from Oxford University Press. I really like the book by Oxana Shevel and Maria Popova, Russia, Ukraine. It's about their divergent trajectories since the collapse of the Soviet Union. I would highly recommend that book. Eugene Finkel has a new book out called Intent to Destroy. That's a history of the relation between Russia and Ukraine going back several centuries, looking at repeated patterns in Tsarist Russia, in the Soviet Union, and now in the post-Soviet period of Russian attempts to basically repress Ukraine, right? That's the title, Intent to Destroy. So that would be three I would recommend. I apologize for recommending one of my own, but also the most recent books by Maria Popova and Oksana Shevel, which is called Russia, Ukraine, and Eugene Finkel's, his book, Intent to Destroy. That's a short list of three that I would recommend to anyone who's watching.
All right. Thanks a lot for this talk. I hope our next conversation will be linked to a more positive news or context. So once again, thanks so much for your time, and I hope we speak again sometime soon.
Thank you very much, Evgenia. Enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.